think I got it. Hey, everybody, it's at Percussion Podcast, episode 214. We've got a roundtable for you, and we're recording on January 12th, 2020. And it's a pretty informal episode, as these often are. I think I'll just go around the room real quick and let you match a name to a voice. So over in Memphis, we have Bill Shaltis.
How's it going?
And over in Corpus Christi, Texas, we have Ksenia Kumyanovich.
Hey.
And upstairs, one floor up from me in the percussion office, is Caleb Pickering.
Hey, hey.
And Ben Charles is in Texas. How's it going, buddy?
Hi, everybody. Doing well?
And Brian Nosney's here.
Hello.
So I asked everyone to pick something compelling for this episode, something to have to do with our field or the craft, art and or music. And I thought I would kick us off by, there was some sad news in the percussion world not today, about a week ago, and it'll be pretty old news by the time this, am I right, Caleb, a week ago?
It's like two days ago?
2 days ago.
Yeah, but so Neil Peart, the famous drummer from the band Rush, passed away, but the family kept it under wraps for 3 days.
Oh, okay.
So the day we heard about it, we have to add 3 to that. So I think it's less than a week, but about a week ago. And of course, by the time this comes out, it'll have been probably a good month or so. But yeah, Neil Peart passed away, and I know it's just been really, really fun and meaningful to see all the Facebook posts and just how many people have cool stories about Rush and Neil Peart. And I don't know. Who has a favorite Neil Peart song and album? Rush song and album. Let's start with Brian.
Favorite song would be Dreamline.
Oh, yes.
That would be my favorite. And that's probably Roll the Bones. It'd be a toss-up between Roll the Bones and... No, actually, it would be Roll the Bones is probably my favorite album. Although Counterparts is a fun one, too.
Oh, great.
Classic.
Counterparts is mine. I thought nobody would say Counterparts. I always hear people say Counterparts is like the one that is nobody's favorite. So I'm glad to hear that.
That opening animate, yep. Like like nothing gets me quite as pumped as just hearing that opening.
I really like that song. Yeah. Bill, what do you think?
I would say for me, it's a tie between the Overture to 2112, the Temples of Syrinx, and then also Subdivisions. Love those 2 tracks. Yeah.
Interesting. Mine was going to be Test for Echo or Counterparts, and then favorite song is Vital Signs from Moving Pictures. I don't know if that rings a bell.
I have a good Moving Pictures story. So I think I got that CD back in the 90s when there was a company called Columbia House that used to send out these mailers that had little stamps on them that you could select like 11 stamps for like 1 penny. You get 11 CDs if you join this club.
I remember
you had
that.
to mail it back in. And so I think that was the first time I got Moving Pictures, was doing that. Like maybe it was like 96, 95, somewhere back there.
Very cool.
I have a funny story about 2112. When I was an undergrad, there was in the student center, there was a giant, kind of pool hall area with tons of pool tables, and they had a jukebox. And I went in there and saw that they had 2112. So I would go in every time and put on the Overture, because for 25 cents I could get 18 minutes of music, and it pissed everyone off.
Oh, right. Because they have long songs. Yeah. That is one of those prog rock definitions, is these like bigger composed, long structured pieces that are all very composed, not like Fish or Grateful Dead, where it's jam band. Jam band epics, which I could never get into. I can't stand Fish. I'd rather go to the dentist than listen to Fish. Sorry, Caleb?
Man, I have another little story like Brian's. I guess it was like 2007. My cool garage rock band covered YYZ for the talent show in high school. And this was back in the day of like internet forums were way more popular than they are now. So like, you'd go on the forums and people would chat about whatever. But I posted a video, and that was my first time getting absolutely shredded by the internet community.
You could play that in high school?
I mean, we played something. We got the hits at the beginning and we ended.
I mean, I remember, this is one of the things I was going to say. Rush is special to me because I rarely reach back. Like Rush is a band that predates what I listened to. Like I never was into Cream. I was never into Kiss. I mean, I knew the Kiss hits. Never even into Led Zeppelin, but Rush, because of the songs that were like YYZ that were just really, really fun to figure out when you're young and just try to be able to play along at all was really, was really something. Anyone else have a favorite?
If you want a fun 5 minutes, there's a YouTube video of Rush playing Tom Sawyer on Rock Band. That's worth a look.
Oh,
It's pretty hilarious.
Fun. The drums are hard on Rock Band. I found I'm much better at guitar than drums.
Yeah, I think if I recall,
And,
Neil's laying it down, and Alex Lifeson is just not doing it on the guitar part.
Well, and they embraced so many pop culture things. The intro, I can't remember which tour it was, but the South Park intro to, I think, Tom Sawyer is just one of the funniest things I've ever seen in my life.
That's
it is
good.
Absolutely hilarious.
Well, I was just going to say a few extra additional things about Mr. Neil Peart. He started playing drums very, very young, and I have two accounts when he was 18. There's one that is, and tell me if any of you know, but he flies to London, England, and goes door to door to try to make a career. But I've also heard, no, it was London in Canada, which I believe is Ontario, London, Ontario, going door to door. So I heard both. I'm sure it's easy to figure out which is correct. So, and he just literally goes door to door to record companies and bands and all these places and tries to make a life as a drummer for himself. And he is in a band, and he goes back, moves home, and starts working for his father, and it's a farm equipment machine business, and he's working for his dad, and I guess this fancy car pulls up, and it's the management for the band Rush, who already had one album out, and of course they were not anything like we know what they are, but they had that first album there, and he asked his dad, should I do this after he gets the audition? And, what should I do? Is this what I should do? And his dad is super supportive and says, yeah, this is like all you've ever wanted to do and all you've ever loved. So, of course. So it's just really cool, like a story of yet again another famous person with big success who had really supportive upbringing and parents. And something you might not know, interesting guy. I mean, he lost his only daughter when she was 19 years old in a car wreck. And 10 months later, his wife died. And in his words, it's from a broken heart. He says she just didn't care anymore. It was due to she just couldn't fight anymore. So he loses his whole family. And years later, he remarries and he has his second daughter. But he's also he's Rush's primary lyricist, and he writes all these lyrics, all these interesting songs. He's an avid reader, and you can dive into a lot of his thinking and thoughts, especially when he was young, talking about Ayn Rand and things like this. And of course, his opinion's vastly different now. But really interesting guy. And I think that the thing to take from him is it's one thing to be a talented musician, but to be an interesting musician is something else. Like to have something to say. It seems like Neil Peart focused a lot on what to say and not just like how to say it. It's one thing to be a writer, but you need to have something to say so that you have an interesting voice. And like I said, there's a lot of cool things on Facebook our friends have put up. And I wanted to read something quick from a former podcast guest and someone who's a friend of the show, who's been on the show and has written for various drum magazines for sure, including Modern Drummer, I believe. But Michael Bettine, our friend, he wrote real quick here. He says, in the 90s, when I was writing for a lot of various music magazines, I was scheduled to interview Neil after a concert. The show ended, and I was ushered backstage. This was the last date of the first leg of a lengthy tour, probably the Roll the Bones tour, he thinks, which is, again, is an album. The band was in one of the dressing rooms having some sort of heated discussion. I sat there for a while listening to muffled voices. Finally, Neil came out and apologized for the wait and said we'd have to do the interview some other time. I later heard rumors that the band was on the verge of splitting up. Fast forward a while, and I got a call from Neil to do the interview over the phone. He was very cordial and in a great mood. We had a great talk, and he really opened up about their music. I have to dig that interview out sometime. Whether you like Neil's drumming or Rush doesn't really matter, but every drummer owes him a great debt for making the drums and drummers so visible to the public, and also for inspiring so many people to take up the drums and strive to move drumming forward. He was quite a man with a big heart and even bigger drumming. Thanks for the memories, Neil. And you can hear stories like that just repeatedly. I found another story, someone saying, I wrote Neil Peart a letter when I was 9 years old saying I was such a fan, and he actually got a handwritten letter back from Neil Peart, and it's just, it's very, very clear he's a person who is so kind and nice and genuine in an industry that doesn't create or favor that at all. And apparently all three of the members of Rush just are that way. So thanks, Michael Bettina. I hope you don't mind that I stole your nice write up there.
Yeah, I just have a couple of quick things to add. I'm probably not nearly the Rush fan that it sounds like Brian and Casey and Bill and maybe Caleb are. But I always enjoy Rush songs on classic rock playlists. And I just wanted to share two kind of interesting things for me. One, it could just be my imagination, but I feel like every year when I go to PASIC, they have Neil Peart's drum set there. Has anyone else noticed that feeling?
They did. Yeah, it's a couple of years as like a donation thing. I can't remember what the company is that owns those drum sets, and they bring them out, and all the proceeds, I think, go to some sort of charity.
Yeah, but they have them like in the exhibit hall. It's like his drums are so iconic, in addition to the player himself, that his drums, also just seeing his drums is like an event in itself. Then the other thing I want to share is when I was reading about him, I noticed that he retired from playing. I think it was in 2015, and it sounds like it was from tendonitis issues. But he's only the second big name percussionist, the other one being Gary Burton, I can think of, that decided to make a conscious decision to retire, which I think speaks volumes to the quality of a player when they realize that something about their health is preventing them to play at the level that they used to, and they don't want to underperform, even though I'm sure they could still sell many tickets and make a whole lot of money. So I thought that was pretty cool.
That is cool.
Ben, playing off of what you said, another thing that is incredibly striking about him is the fact that at his level of success that he was at later in his career, he still went back and took lessons with Freddie Gruber. Like late in his career, just kind of went, I need to figure some things out, and went and started taking lessons again. And that's so striking when you think of the pedestal that so many drummers hold him on. That's really something incredible, I think.
It's funny looking at his drum set. I don't know if you all ever look at that kit. And, when you're a kid, you think like, oh, I want nothing more than to play that. But I look at that kit now and I think like, dude, that looks hard to play. Like, why are those toms 4 feet above his hi-hat, like way over there? Which is probably a Buddy Rich thing. He did these Buddy Rich tribute CDs and projects. And I know, like, yeah, some of those guys, they're like, Buddy Rich had these, toms like way up high, like over here, out of the way. And I think part of that was maybe the showmanship, like to get the player visible, so your rack toms aren't like covering half your body.
Yeah, I'm also just like, who wants to move all that? God.
Well, he did.
Called roadie.
Yeah, but for those of us that don't have roadies,
I would move it for him. I would pay him to let me move it.
Well, I doubt his set was like that big when they started like Fly By Night, for instance. I don't think his set was as massive as it became.
No, but when you start to get into like Exit Stage Left and the trees and stuff, like it becomes pretty massive. And then remember that before the days of his mallet cat and stuff, he was hauling around chimes and a Glock and crotales and all sorts of stuff.
Spear radio, man. You got to have those.
Yep, that's right.
It's really, really cool. Well, and so many of the songs, also the lyrics, a lot of science fiction influence, but also social, political things and statements. And it sort of reminds me of something I mentioned on the podcast probably, some years ago now. But if the name Greg Gaffin rings a bell, it's Bad Religion singer, and something he says about how lyrics through music are so impactful and valuable is that it lets you absorb the message at your own pace. So if you're attracted to a song and you learn the words, but the music keeps you listening to it, and eventually the words will seep in when you're ready for them to. So if some song has a message, you'll hear it when you need to. You won't just hear it right there and then, and it won't be a message like waved in your face, because it's not packaged in a way that like, hey, this is about just this message and you need to read this essay about this concept or whatever. Yep.
It was a running joke for a long time that Rush was not ever going to get elected into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They were like the Glenn Close of rock and roll, because they had been around for 40 years but had never made it into the Rock Hall of Fame, and they finally got inducted. I think it was in 2013. So it took them that long. Yeah, that late.
Yeah, that's bizarre. Huh.
Yeah.
And it's striking when you think about the fact of a group that's been around for that long, that has, every time they go on tour, the shows are sold out. Like, it's non-negotiable. And when you think about the presence that they have for the songs that they have, when progressive rock like just died in the late 70s and early 80s, for them to still go on through the 80s, through the 90s, through the 2000s, and they would sell out, just non-negotiable. It's incredible to see them stand that test of time.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I read that, that was a late induction. He was inducted into the Modern Drummers Readers Poll Hall of Fame in 1983, making him the youngest person ever honored there. So.
Oh wow! Yeah, I did not know that.
So that would have been just like after like Moving Pictures then.
Yeah.
Pretty close.
Yep.
So even that's kind of late.
Yeah.
Yeah, for them. Yeah. Anyway, it's cool to hear everyone's thoughts about Neil Peart and kind of reminisce. Who else has something that they want to share? I know we have several other things to focus on. Ben, do you have one?
I do. So when we were trying to come up with a sort of some topic to have for this episode instead of just a potpourri episode, we kind of talked about something along the lines that I don't think any of us were really happy with the phrasing of the question, but basically the question was, what to you makes music good or art good? And that's obviously kind of like an icky phrasing, but that's the gist of it. And so I wanted to talk about one of what I think is one of the most interesting composers around. And actually, Casey earlier actually wrote this down. Casey said, it's one thing to be a talented musician, but to be an interesting musician is something else. And I think this person
said that?
Yeah, like 5 minutes ago. Yeah, I just wrote that down.
That sounds like someone with a master's degree. That's good.
Yeah. So, but anyway, the person I wanted to talk about today is Mark Applebaum. And I didn't want to go on too long about him, but I figured he was probably a good discussion starter. Someone else might have something to contribute. But I wanted to point out 3 resources if anyone's interested in Mark Applebaum. One, he has a TED Talk, which if you are hearing me talk about Mark Applebaum and that name sounds familiar, you've probably already seen his TED Talk. 2, there's a lecture he did called Radical Creativity, The Dilemma of Being Best and Worst. And 3, he was actually our At Percussion episode 31 guest. So if you want more information, you can check that out. But he's a professor of composition at Stanford, has worked with Steve Schick a lot, who's obviously in our wheelhouse. But I just wanted to share a few notes about him. One is that one of his primary instigators in his art form is experimentation. And he says that he considers himself an experimenter in the same way that the scientists at Stanford University are experimenters. And so he says the point of doing an experiment isn't that you know it's going to work, but it's to see what happens. So a lot of his works are just sort of bizarre out there, like what would that look like sorts of things. So for example, he has a concerto for florist and orchestra. So it's a performance piece for an actual florist putting together flower arrangements as the concerto soloist. So obviously there's probably not too many pieces in the concerto for florist repertoire. So that's an interesting take on what exactly would happen. He also says one of his primary sort of artistic inspirations is boredom. And so in the TED Talk, he plays a little excerpt of a Beethoven piano sonata. And in the other talk I mentioned, Radical Creativity, he plays Heart and Soul. And so he plays the tune exactly as it's written, and he says, "I wrote that." And the audience laughs, and he says, "No, I didn't write that. That was by Beethoven." And And he talks about how it's a good piece of music, but to him at this point it's boring. He's heard it 1,000 times over, and it's not interesting anymore. And so then he proceeds. He's also a jazz pianist, in fact, a brilliant jazz pianist. He proceeds to improvise over the tune, and he says that to me, it's not better, but it's more interesting because it's new, it's exciting, it's different. It's not the same thing that I've been playing since I was 7 years old. And then in the radical creativity talk, he talks about what he calls moral valence, where he balances consumption versus experimentation. So, for example, under consumption, he talks about his orchestral works that are concerned with melody, and that would be obviously a sort of consumer-driven art form, whereas the experimentation would be the Concerto for Florist and Orchestra, which is obviously avant-garde, not consumer-driven, and something sort of like, I don't know, just out there and different and interesting. And then going along with this experimentation, he has a piece I find really interesting called Straight Jacket. It's in 4 movements. I think possibly my favorite movement is there are 5 players and each one has an easel with a contact mic on it. And they all have like a big fat Sharpie, and they're drawing these what I call like alien hieroglyphs to make this like connecting picture between all 5 different images. It's pretty hip, cool stuff. But then anyway, it got me thinking about like experimentation in music is nothing new. And I think when we see someone like Mark Applebaum doing something as out there as his piece, The Metaphysics of Notation, to us is just like this shocking out there thing. But I tried to think back historically, and I just came up with 3 examples that can sort of represent experimentation throughout the centuries of music. So one is, everyone familiar with the composer J.S. Bach? Here, I think probably most of us are. So J.S. Bach had 20 children. Many of them turned out to be musicians. One of them was Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, CPE Bach for short. And in my music appreciation class, I kind of talk about how, I don't know if this is maybe the most accurate way to portray it, but he rebelled against his father's style, where J.S. Bach was writing music as architecture. CPE Bach came up with this Im Feinschimmer style, which is German for sensitive style. So it was more humanesque music. And then moving forward in music, by probably about 50 years or so after that, we get Hector Berlioz with his Symphonie Fantastique, which was an early example of a programmatic symphony. Many of us are probably already familiar, but symphonies are typically in 4 movements, and then Symphonie Fantastique is in 5 movements. And each movement represents a different sort of scene for this tortured artist that falls in love with a woman, and he sees her at a ball, and he gets all these sorts of haunting thoughts and has to leave the ball, and he goes and lies in a field, and then he goes into this dream where he kills his beloved, and then he's executed at the scaffold, and the final movement is him dancing in a wicked orgy with ghouls and demons, his words, not mine. So obviously kind of a pretty out there step for 5 or 6 years or so after Beethoven's Final Symphony was premiered. And then a much more recent example of experimentation, I think, is Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody, which obviously we were talking about long songs. It's, for a pop tune, quite a long song. It has no chorus, which most pop songs have choruses, and it's in different sections with different tempos, kind of has some operatic elements. So to me, experimentation, I think, as a whole is an interesting concept in music, and Mark Applebaum is certainly a master of that sort of stuff. Does anyone else have Mark Applebaum experiences or thoughts to share?
I met him very briefly, and that was, I was starstruck. The photo that I have with him, it's really funny. I think my face definitely shows that I'm like peeing my pants. But I think what I really like about him is, especially in that TED Talk, but I guess that's how he always speaks, is this way that he presents himself with his sort of like unobtrusive narcissism, where he puts himself at the center of everything, and he just wants to be amused and wants to experiment, but it truly isn't offensive. It isn't, I don't know, I find it to be like the kindest form of narcissism that I've encountered in a creative person. I really like him.
Yeah, I feel like he's tricking us when he says his narcissism. It's like, you're being really humble and kind, and but he's also kind of teaching us a lesson. I think he's saying, like it's kind of a selfish thing. Like you're just making art, you're doing what you love at this rate that is so obsessive and all the time, and that kind of fits into what I love how he puts as his life plan, the Taco Bell plan, meaning that even if he has to be poor and work at Taco Bell, he is going to be a happy composer, and he thinks that that is still a life worth living. And it's just ironic that that is sort of has been his motto, and I believe his genuine thoughts. I think he's not being cute when he says that. I mean, I think he really did believe that, and I mean, I know other people who felt the same way, and I felt the same way. And then he because of that attitude and that method of pursuit, he winds up in arguably the most prestigious composition job in the country, or at least one of them.
It's funny, he does. I think his term he uses is abundant narcissism, which it's just completely. I mean, his sense of humor. But that Stanford lecture that I mentioned, he actually starts out talking about the organizational structure of Stanford, and he pinpoints in the middle there's this composer me, and then he builds the music department up around him, and then the arts, and then the bureaucracy, and then athletics. Then he's like, but at the center of it all, of course, is me. So.
I love talking about aphasia when talking about composition and meaning, and sort of back to being not just being a composer, but being someone with something to say, like we mentioned Neil Peart was. I love that aphasia is. I love showing. Sorry, I'll back up. I love showing aphasia to students and saying, "Hey, this is a piece for soprano." The composer specifically says, I think he says soprano, right? Or does he say singer, something like that?
I think it's soprano, but yeah,
I think it's soprano. It's a voice, no matter what. But and then they're like, wait, they didn't say a thing, and immediately it's just interesting discussion in a cup, I mean, just automatic, instant, interesting discussion. Yeah. Has anyone ever played Catfish?
Can I just talk about the irony of what just happened? Casey was like, it just automatically creates instant discussion, and then no one says anything.
and then the episode just tanked. Yeah.
I love how we lean into those now because we know Casey will edit them out.
Well, but now we're saying something funny, so I'll keep it.
Yep, perfect. As well, you should.
That's happened many, many times.
Casey, you mentioned his piece, Catfish.
Yeah, has anyone played Catfish?
I played it.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. I want to play it. Professor Ginnivan wants to play it. I want to do it sometime.
It's real cool.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely have enjoyed it before. I've just never played it. Well, let's move right along.
So I've been thinking a lot about the role of social media and the internet in my own life and in my students' life, and how it's not always the most healthy thing. And so I'm going to get this kicked off. This is from a book by Cal Newport called Digital Minimalism. And it's a quote from comedian Bill Maher. And here's the quote. It says, "The tycoons of social media have to stop pretending that they're friendly nerd gods building a better world and admit they're just tobacco farmers in t-shirts selling an addictive product to children. Because let's face it, checking your likes is the new smoking." And quotes like that really got me thinking about I'm not immune to it all. I know my students aren't immune to it. There's a reason why Facebook, the notification button is red rather than when it was initially launched, as it was a blue button and it wasn't getting the same kind of use.
Oh, right,
and it's because you get this kind of hit, this little dopamine hit every time you see that red thing light up. Just like if in Instagram, if you see the hearts. So this got me thinking about how this can play into what I do as a teacher, how I approach my craft in terms of practicing as well. And geez, how much of my time is getting hijacked by technology. And so I found this great book, like I said, by Cal Newport, who's ironically enough a professor of computer science at Georgetown. And it's called Digital Minimalism, and he has a ton of other great books as well. But the whole concept behind digital minimalism is, to quote again, "a philosophy of technology use in which you focus your online time on a small number of carefully selected and optimized activities that strongly support things you value and then happily miss out on everything else." And so it's not this Luddite thing where you got to give up technology completely, because I don't think that's possible or feasible. But it is selecting the things that mean the most to you and using them effectively to help you do whatever you need to do. And so you go through this whole process. The first thing that you need to do is something called digital declutter. And so Newport asks you to come up with how you're going to use the technology, what apps are vital to you that you absolutely have to have, and ignore everything else. And once you've determined that, try a digital declutter process of 30 days and see how it goes. Basically, just kind of this overall big detox of things. And so for me, what that meant was, I'll give you a couple of the things that I came up with. I'm going to strip down my phone to the essentials of exactly what I need. So I have my music on there. I have podcasts. I have music apps like metronome apps, things like that, banking apps, insurance apps, fitness apps. I took everything else off. I took Facebook off. I took Instagram off. I took all of the television apps off, everything else. Same thing with the iPad, stripping all of those apps away. And then I said to myself, I'm going to only do my messaging on computer. So anytime I've got text messages, which is really, really hard, I'm only going to do text messages on my computer, all email on the computer, and all Facebook messaging on the computer. Social media, I'm giving myself a 10-minute daily cap on Facebook and Instagram. And the only way I'm going to post is post things that, for instance, upcoming events at the University of Memphis or the Two Rivers Summit, things like that. Other than that, I'm not going to post anything. And I'm also going to try and avoid interacting as much as possible as well, because again, it goes back to this whole dopamine hit thing. If you're receiving the hit, it's one thing. In the same way too, you don't want to go the other way and just mindlessly like. It's much more important to have meaningful conversations with people rather than just having this sort of passive like things. These are some of the things that Newport says. Now you're going to ultimately give up a lot of your time by doing this, and so you've got to come up with a way to fill up that time. And so it's suggested. Let me get it here real quick. Coming up with ways that you can replace this internet time with more meaningful and tangible things that take a lot more care and a lot more thinking. And so for me, I did a couple of different things. I decided to end my online subscription to the New York Times, and I actually got a real newspaper subscription to the local Memphis paper. And so now I'm consuming my news actually holding a physical newspaper, and that's the way that I do that. I decided to take up woodworking. Thought, why not? So I already had like a miter saw. I already had some basic tools. I thought it'd be fun to like come up with some different kinds of crafts. So I bought a router. I watched a bunch of YouTube videos, some do-it-yourself stuff about how to use those routers, how to get started with things, different kinds of projects. And so now that activity is starting to consume like all this other time that would have been devoted to probably being online, mindlessly like clicking through Facebook, things like that. So the point of it is just to kind of take a step back. For me, I can remember a time, and there's a couple other people in this panel that we're all roughly the same age, where about half of our life really existed before the internet became the internet, and before smartphones certainly became smartphones. I know Ksenia's shaking her head no, but I think Brian, yeah, we can both definitely remember a time like before the internet became the internet, before Napster and things like that, and it really intrigued me to like try and go back as best I could to like what that was like, because I think in some ways. Yes, I'm less connected to the world, but at the same time, I tended to be more focused and a happier individual overall.
Yeah.
And it's an interesting experiment. So if you're interested in it, it's a really, really easy read, Digital Minimalism by Cal Newport. It's got a lot of really good ideas. I don't agree 100% with everything in the book, but I think it's got a lot of good concepts that even if you don't embrace everything, it can really bring some meaning, I think, back into your life by just getting rid of some of the digital clutter and embracing things that we've all kind of gotten rid of, like conversations rather than doing text messaging. Trying to do craft projects that you have something with a tangible outcome to it. So those were just a couple of my thoughts, and I encourage students to try and think about that, and particularly the young students who have grown up in a world where they don't remember a world without the internet or smartphones. It's an interesting thing. There's definitely a correlation between when smartphones became so pervasive and the rise of anxiety in especially this current generation. And there's a great article in the Atlantic that kind of shows there's this trend of like, okay, you can pinpoint exactly when smartphones became ubiquitous, and there's this upward trend of anxiety. So I think just getting out of that cycle and just kind of going back to what we are, which is social creatures, and having really honest to goodness face-to-face conversations is such an important thing.
I feel lucky. Something that regulates it for me is my eyes get tired looking at a screen. Even they just get tired. Like I get tired looking at a screen, and it's like so many emails every day. We do the podcast here now, and then I go edit it, and then I do my own video editing, etc. And something I was going to tell you all that was so funny. So my son, he'll be 2 years old by the time this podcast comes out, but I saw him do this. I've got Gene Kaczynski's CD here, but just pretend it's a book. I saw him do this with the book. He took the book, opened it, and he went. Do you see that? I know if you're listening, you can't see that, but he tried to swipe a page of the book, and he like turned it over and he tried to swipe, and he swiped. I mean, he hasn't held a cell phone that many times, but he's just seen us do it. He sees you do it, and they figure it out quick, and it's just amazing. Like he already has the cell phone figured out, and it's only a matter of time till he knows how to pick it up, go to YouTube, and find his favorite show, which is trucks or tractors or whatever. Ben, I think you had something.
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts about this. One thing I like is watching like technology documentaries, and CNN has this series called, I think there's one for the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s, but they have different focuses on each episode. Some talk about politics, some talk about TV, some talk about music, and so on. And on one of the technology ones, I remember hearing Tom Hanks actually talking about TV and how addictive, I think it was TV anyway, it was how addictive TV was becoming when, color TV came out or something. Basically, the refrain every single generation is, this will rot your brains out. When radio came out, people said, that'll rot your brains out. When TV came out, that'll rot your brains out. When the internet, social media came out, that'll rot your brains out. To me, I think the point that we're really making is that these are very powerful tools. And things that are powerful can be used for great good or great harm, like nuclear power can be used to make a nuclear weapon, but it can also be used to provide clean energy for a city. And so with social media, I mean, like it's not much of an exaggeration, I hope, to say that a lot of Casey's early success as a composer and performer was actually because of his YouTube videos. And if no one was on social media sharing those YouTube videos, people probably wouldn't have found out as much about Casey. So I think that I don't like consciously like limit my like social media consumption or whatever, but like I only have Facebook. I don't have Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram. Like I'm one distraction is enough for me. So yeah, I think just being wise about it, and I don't like really post things and hoping of getting like 1,000 likes or something. Usually I'll just share like a funny picture or something. But then also one other thing, this is just sort of tangential, but I was watching a documentary on YouTube about the original Sony Walkman. And the thing with the Walkman is that it was the first time music ever became an exclusively personal activity. You used to, if you wanted to listen to music, at first you went to a concert, and then after that you could go like to a jukebox or get your own boombox or turn on the radio, but music was always played out loud. And there's this like hilarious clip of some politician talking about how like the Walkman is going to like just create the most like antisocial society. Like everyone's just going to be in their own. It's like, dude, like people just listen to music on the bus all the time. Like it's not that big of a deal. So I don't know, just like as a tangential, just it's funny how technology changes over time. We don't really think anything about someone walking around with headphones on now.
Well, to your point though, Ben, Newport actually, one of the things he talks about is how we've lost solitude as a culture. And he cites like Thoreau's Walden. I'll bunch through one of the chapters, but the point being human means you need to have both the social interactions, but you also need times where you're just thinking, and you're not listening to music, you're not listening to anything else. You're just kind of walking by yourself without thinking, or without listening or doing any other activity. And that is something we've kind of lost, is that balance.
it seems like such an easy thing to get out of balance. And like Ben said, like you can, if you get a social media following as a musician, you can, get some traction for your career. And yeah, I totally think you're right, Ben. I mean, who the heck's going to buy a piece for 2 hi-hats and playback unless you can like already verify that's something you would be interested in? Like just the notion of it sounds absurd.
Yeah, I mean,
but yeah, you share it around, and all of a sudden people are, oh, sorry, you're being snarky. Let's hear it.
Yeah, I saw it. I'm still not into it. No, I'm kidding.
I'm not into it either, I don't think. But yeah, it's so easy to get out of balance on that. So yeah, thanks, Bill. It's important to say that here, I think, because it's so tempting to, try to get ahead of the curve. Or I know Caleb and I have had conversations where it's, if like you didn't get on YouTube during the right time, like it seems like there was maybe a window. And if you didn't get on there at that time, you sort of miss this wave. And it's much, much harder to gain popularity now. And we're kind of wondering, like, so what's the next thing to get on? Is it Snapchat or TikTok or Instagram? It sounds like it was Instagram back when we were having that conversation. But thanks. I think, Caleb, I think you're next.
I think Ben's got something.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Casey, actually, something you said reminded me of something. I was so taken aback by the fact that I was chosen first to talk about Mark Applebaum. I forgot like one of my main points. I'll do it real quick. But one thing he talks about is in his talks, he invents instruments. So one of his instruments is called the Mouseketeer, and it has combs and door stops and squeaky wheels and all sorts of stuff on it. But he says that like the cool thing about inventing an instrument is that you're the world's best Mouseketeer player or whatever you are,
right,
in a group of one. But he says also, though, you have to concede at that point that you are the world's worst Mouseketeer player because you're again in a party of one. And it reminded me a while back of a discussion we had where Casey said, "Oh, I've got an idea for a piece of. We're going to put 80 bass drums up in the rafters, and we're going to write a piece for that." And as artists and composers, I think sometimes people get caught up in the fact of inventing something. And Mark Applebaum talks about it's actually being the worst Mouseketeer player in the world that inspires him to think about, okay, well, if this is what the worst is, what is an intermediate Mouseketeer player? What would that look like? Or what would an advanced Mouseketeer player, what would that look like? And so, any idiot can write a piece for 80 bass drums up in the rafters. And it'd probably be kind of cool because it's unique, but what does a better piece for 80 bass drums up in the rafters look like, et cetera? So I thought that was an interesting point of discussion. Totally unrelated to what we were just talking about, but I wrote that down to share and I forgot, and you just reminded me of it. So.
Oh, sure. Yeah, vision is easy, but like execution is a whole other discussion.
Yeah. And I mean, just like trying to push something that has no point of reference for what it should be. I mean, we can reference what a good symphony is today. We can't reference what a good 80 bass drum in the rafters piece is. So, yeah.
Yeah. Caleb, I think.
Yeah. And I apologize in advance. Mine has some diagrams and such, so I'll just describe them as best as I can. So
we want to see them.
Get your thinking caps out. So I wanted to talk about mainly one book, but another one ties in. One is Performing in the Zone by John Gorey. It's a really, really, really good book. Tim Jones at UNLV Las Vegas had us buy it and read it and go through it. I'll talk about that a little bit. But the other one is, you probably know of other ones, it's Tim Galway's The Inner Game of Golf. Mm-hmm. Has anybody read that, or The Inner Game of Tennis?
I've read the tennis music one.
Yeah, so I think the golf one, I've read the tennis, the golf, and the music. I think the music is the worst one. Sorry if Barry Green is reading or listening. Sorry about that. But I think golf is the best one because he does everything in the tennis book, and then he learns the new skill of golf. So he's like writing the golf book and applying his own methods to a new skill set as he goes through it. So I think it has a little more weight, and it's a little bit more interesting because he changes his thoughts on a few things. But yeah, this Performing in the Zone one is really good. So it's kind of like Casey has the issue with, we should always look at Anders Ericsson's research on the 10,000 hour rule as opposed to the Malcolm Gladwell or Jeff Colvin outliers and that stuff. But basically, what the book does is it goes through these flow states. So if you've ever read, and forgive me on pronunciation, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's book Flow, if you've read that, or there was a lot of YouTube and Facebook videos going around the past 2 years about this Buddhist idea of monkey mind, or psychologists and anthropologists talk about play states, which is kind of what Bill was talking about, where if you get through too much distraction, you lose this ability to like play naturally and kind of lose yourself in what you're doing. But yeah, the book is basically, it goes through 4 parts. The first one is it explains what it is, the theory of it. And yeah, you said you want to see it. So it's got a lot of weird charts and algebra looking numbers. But basically it boils down to this idea of P equals P minus I. So your performance equals your preparation minus interference. So the performance you're going to have is only going to be as good as prepared you are. And then there's always going to be some sort of interference that comes out of it, be it stage fright or maybe diet, exercise, any things like that. But he goes a step further and he turns it into this equation that's, if you want to follow along, is RLP, which is your resultant level of performance, equals, in parentheses, C plus P minus E, out of parentheses, plus A. So, sorry, I know it's a lot to go through. So basically what it means is your performance level is more or less C is your performance ability, like your intelligence, your musical intelligence, plus your P, which is your physical attributes. So your musical intelligence plus your chops, minus your external interference, so things you can't control, and then minus any arousal, which is like stage fright, anxiety, things like that. Which I always bring up in lessons with students that are a little maybe underprepared, because it's like, yeah, you might have the musical knowledge, but if you don't have the chops, it doesn't matter. And likewise, you might be a master of technique, but if you don't know what you're trying to like say behind the instrument, then again, you've kind of got a souped up sports car with no gas. Yeah. So basically, he goes through this this way of saying your performance should be on a +5 to -5 scale. So like right now, all 5 of you are probably sitting at just a flat 0, which is just calm, you're listening. I might be at a +1 because I'm speaking about something. And he talks about how important it is to get students to have the correct performance arousal or performance anxiety. He uses arousal because it's a less negative term. Anxiety has like a negative connotation to it. But he says if you're doing something like public speaking, you might be a +1 or +2. If you want to be like a motivational speaker, you'd want to be like at a +3, a little bit more. If you're like a pro wrestler, you should be at like the highest +5 because you should go out and kick some asses. But it's really interesting because he goes through all this, and before you even dive into what it's really about, he has you write out and really self-reflect on where your anxiety might stem from. And so he kind of gets you to bring up any past trauma or issues like that. So it's a good stepping stone to, I think, therapy I think everybody needs it, but for people that maybe really need it for anxiety or performance anxiety. But he has you kind of confront why you have these issues with anxiety and performing. And then he goes through 33 different techniques to occupy what Tim Galway from the Inner Game books, he calls it your self 1 and your self 2. So has any of y'all been on stage, like playing, you're doing your thing, and you have like that random thought that's like, oh man, did I buy beer for the after party?
Oh, yeah.
Did I turn off the stage? So he calls that voice that kind of jumps into your head and interrupts your kind of flow state as your self 1, and your self 2 is your strong performing ability. So the idea is these 33 techniques aren't supposed to make you less nervous. They're supposed to give you 33 different ways you can try to occupy that self 1 voice, that one that does jump in and say like, maybe if you go only on muscle memory, because I know a lot of young students do, and then they hit that wrong note because they're on a different board, and then suddenly their world is shattered because they're going off muscle memory, and now it sounds different and it looks different. So these 33 techniques are something to occupy that oh shit voice that's coming in and help calm them down. And the idea isn't to have 33 things that work. There's 33 tried and true successful methods, and you go through and you find the ones that actually help you. So as you go through all 33 of these, and then he goes through a nice third section, which is really, it's a 12-week program, which is really great because that's normally a one semester for most of us. Tim Jones at UNLV, before I got there, he had the whole studio go through it for the semester, 12 weeks. And he just had overwhelmingly positive results. There's a great Percussive Notes article you can read about. But the 12 weeks touch on everything that majorly affects your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So it talks about adjusting diet and slight exercise, not hitting the gym and free weights every day, just little things like 30 minutes of motion a day to keep your blood moving. It talks about sleep habits, mental health, neurolinguistics and neurolinguistic programming and how to occupy yourself in that way, meditation. It also employs your chosen methods of those 33 and how to employ them throughout those 12 weeks. So ideally, by the end of the 12 weeks or one semester, if you're going to actually put it into play, you have a very concrete control of your emotional responses, especially on stage, and you're able to manage that distractor self that keeps that keeps jumping in and kind of breaking that flow state. So the idea is that cool state of flow that we all find, like when you have a really good performance, the idea is you're able to keep that longer. And it's kind of like meditation. Like you meditate the first time and you can't do it for very long, but as you get older, you can do it for longer and longer periods. But yeah, that's just a little bit book. I'm a big supporter of it. I think it's a great read. There's Gary Chick. He's a PhD of anthropology at Penn State. He actually talks a little bit about this state of play. He says we still play, but much of it seems to lack a playful quality as we get older, because there's this idea that it's like if you try to get somebody to be really expressive, like it's hard because you don't want to look stupid, kind of, is what, even though you don't, like you feel like you might look goofy. And he says playfulness has been replaced by aggressiveness and the feeling that more is crammed into less. And I feel like I do that a lot. I know Casey said he used to do that more, where you're, instead of performing like emotionally, you're trying to cram a lot of aggression and a lot of like ferocity into a small amount to make up for like an emotional performance, if that makes sense. But
Sure.
Either way, yeah, the books actually, they almost read chapter to chapter simultaneously. They like pair up really nicely, but they're really cheap. I think you can get the two of them for about $25. But yeah, I think it really helped me in my master's with getting better at playing and not being nervous and not being able to control what I want to do versus having my anxiety control what's going to happen.
Wow, cool. Bill, I think.
Yeah, I was just going to piggyback on what Caleb said. One thing that stuck with me was something that Joe Petrasic, who was in Kansas City when I was in Kansas City and is now principal percussion of Atlanta Symphony, said. He's always looking to perform optimally, never perfectly. And I loved that as a quote, and that's something I share with my students too, because it really got me thinking, like, if you think you put yourself in the mindset of trying to perform perfectly, there's just a lot of tension inherent in that. I think if you step back and say, if you want to perform optimally, okay, what are the things that I can do to make sure that I'm performing to the best of my abilities, and then I'm going to go out there and do it. So that kind of piggybacks again, like off of what Caleb was saying.
Just what Caleb was saying there, getting into the whole meditation and stuff. There's a book out there that I read called 10% Happier by Dan Harris. He's a correspondent for ABC News, co-anchor for the weekend edition of Good Morning America. But he talks about how he had like an on-air freak out. And so he started to really go deep into meditation and figuring that out. That was a book that I read that was really interesting and kind of started me down that path of trying to meditate every day. And that, what Caleb was saying about that quieting that voice in your head that's saying, did I pick up beer for the after party and whatever.
That second voice is interesting because it creeps in when I just kind of don't want to play. Like sometimes everything's going fine. Like it only comes around when stuff's going really great. Like, and you're almost just lazy or sleepy, if it's a piece where you have a lot of downtime, or you have to wait, or you're playing Temescal and you have to wait for the introduction, and it's, a good minute and a half or 2 minutes or something, it's pretty long before you actually play a note. And yeah, it's interesting.
It's kind of neat with, I think, older players, if your muscle memory is good or your aural or visual memory is good, you can like survive because you go on autopilot for longer. But the younger you are and the worse those memories are, the more likely you are to crash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it's nice to have a method that, I don't know, I mean, my advice has always been like, well, you just have to be like so prepared that you're comfortable, and the more you do that, the more you're going to find comfort on stage. But that takes so many years. It'd be really nice to have something that you're also controlling in the meantime, and like a method that you're consciously trying to do in the meantime, and not just saying like, okay, I practiced as much as possible, I hope the performance goes well.
Casey,
I think that
kind of follow that up. One thing that's like always terrified me is, I'm guessing probably all of us here are memorizers of music, because just by the very nature of playing percussion, we often can't do page turns and things like that. So especially marimba solos, we end up memorized. I don't think I've ever consciously memorized a piece. I don't think I've ever like sat down and tried to memorize it. Just as I learned it, it just goes into my memory. And that's the thing that terrifies me the most is I don't know what I'm doing. And furthermore, because I don't know what I'm doing, I don't know how to prevent that from failing. And I've never had any major memory slip where I've had to walk off stage and look at the score or anything like that. I've never had any catastrophic failure, but that's one thing that I'm always afraid of. Is like I don't know what I'm doing.
Yeah, right. You're not really in control. You're just like, oh man, I hope my brain and my hands remember how this works.
Yeah. Gary Cook had a really interesting method. I don't know how long he did it for, but he had his undergrad students. So he would have them grip their sticks or mallets like really hard, like when you tense up, and he would have them like think and recite like positive experiences and moments. Mm-hmm. So the idea was you do it enough that when you start getting tense during a performance, you start relaxing, because as you tense up, you associate that tense feeling with relaxing. So it helps to back you off. Mm-hmm. And that's in the book as well. Yeah.
That's sort of how Dwight Schrute hit his self. No, it's how he Jim tricked him with the mints.
Yeah. My mouth feels all dry. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Pavlovian response.
Response conditioning. Yeah.
I think you can take too something from the cognitive behavioral therapy textbook in terms of if anxiety is something that really is a problem for you. If you're doing cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the ways to do that is to approach your fear and just immerse yourself in your fear and just realize that you're not going to die and you're not going to train wreck, all these other things. So if anxiety and stage fright is a problem, just start doing small performances, whether it's like mock auditions, whether it's like performances for senior homes or for elementary schools, audiences that maybe aren't going to be super judgy. Just get all of those nerves out of the system. And also, if you're going to do like orchestral auditions and you don't know what the setup's going to be, try to play on as many different axes as you can, try to play on as many different xylophones and bells, have them set really high, really low, just try and take away all of those variables so you can really focus on what you need to do.
I've thought for a really long time I would like to do very simple exercises in studio class, make everyone stand up and read a poem, a short something in front of everyone. They don't have a lot of time to prepare, and they just have to sit there and be in that environment. And also it's in such a place of safety, because it's, hey, this isn't performance. It's not something we all know you didn't spend a lot of time on this, that sort of thing. I don't know. Do you guys think that would be a good idea? I've wanted to do it for a long time. It could be.
A way that my professors, when I was a kid, tried to treat me from performance anxiety was that they would, on the bus ride to the event, they would give me a piece and say, "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have enough program. You are going to have to sight read this." So you sight read in front of an audience, something that's very simple, and it falls apart. It doesn't matter. Eventually, you realize you don't die.
Right.
Isn't that one of the messages in Fight Club? Like if you're like actually in physical fist fights day in and day out, you're not afraid of anything anymore, and it just really turns the volume down on a. We should start a basic Fight Club committee.
Yeah, put everyone in the ring.
Actually, I bet there's a lot of people that are just dying to beat up each other anyway.
My money's on Harnsberger. I'm going to say that right now.
Oh, yeah.
That dude's ripped. That dude's ripped, and he probably has excellent feet work too, because he's not a tall guy.
No.
Yeah.
We just need to have some cage matches at PASIC.
Yeah.
This is such a
Versus Burrett.
dangerous topic.
Yeah. No, I think it would be a hit.
I would pay double what PASIC costs to see the Burrett boys duke it out.
Oh, that's because now you're getting into family. There's some that's a whole different level there.
That's how we should pick presidents.
Hey, let's get Brian's topic in there.
Well, one quick thing to piggyback on what other teachers were saying about performance anxiety and stuff like that. I remember struggling with that a lot when I was at North Texas, and I went to every one of my teachers and asked them like how they dealt with it. And I remember Rennick saying at one point, kind of going along the lines of what everyone was saying, just like, listen, you're not like, if a mistake happens, no one's going to die or anything like that. But he put a really good spin on it of saying like, listen, everyone that's in that audience wants you to succeed. Everyone there wants to hear your best and is rooting for you. And if there's anyone out there that's not, then they don't get it and you're not playing for them. And that was something that always kind of struck me as like, yeah, that really puts a better spin on it. I think a much more positive spin on things. So
I've heard that so much, and I remember telling myself that when I really had I think the regular struggles that people have with nerves, and man, I could just never get it to help. It's like I could not trick myself, I could not trick myself, and like that we all know that's the case, but somehow, we're still nervous. It's an interesting thing.
But the thing that I tend to share, going to the kind of the subject matter, what I've been sharing with my students kind of regularly is when they're going up for something, whether it's an audition or they're entering a competition or something like that. Jim Campbell sent this to myself and a bunch of his grad students and his former grad students. There was a point where a bunch of us had there were like 3 or 4 of us that all had job interviews in the same semester, and none of us got gigs. And he sent this episode of the Tim Ferriss podcast. I think it's just called the Tim Ferriss Show. He sent it's episode 243 is the one he sent. It's called How to Fear Less, and Vince Vaughn is the guest on it. I might have shared this, I can't remember, but he basically talks to Vince Vaughn about this, and one of the things that points that Jim was trying to get across to us was Vince Vaughn talks about the idea of Vince Vaughn is the actor. We've seen him in True Detective and Wedding Crashers and all sorts of things, but he goes along those lines, and Vince Vaughn is talking to this audience. It was a live show, and he says, all of you out there know me as an actor, and you probably know me. You probably think maybe I'm a successful actor, and you know me from 5 or 6 maybe movie roles or television roles, something like that. He says, the reality is, though, you know me from those, say, 5 or 6 roles. Do you have any idea how many auditions I've taken? Do you have any idea how many rejections I've gotten? And rejections for things like as stupid as like too tall, or rejections without any feedback, just like, we just want to go in a different direction or something like that. He's like, for the 5 or 6 roles that I have that you know me from and think I'm successful for, there are 100 auditions or so that I failed at. So just kind of trying to put in perspective the idea of that we're going to have those successes, but our successes are far and away going to be outnumbered by the amount of failures that we have. And so how we grow from those failures. And that ties me into another one that's along similar lines is I'm a big Stephen King fan, but one of the best books that he wrote is a nonfiction book called On Writing, which is just about kind of his thoughts on the craft and everything like that. And one of the things he talks about is when he was very young, and he was sending like short stories to pulp magazines and stuff trying to get published, and he would get rejection upon rejection upon rejection. And every time he got a rejection letter, he would take it out and he would tape it to the wall of his bedroom. And the line just started to go around the room after a while. And his thought process was, I refuse to let these people dictate my failure, basically. And so he just kept going, and everything was just more fuel to the fire. And now we see him as this hugely successful author and stuff. So that's something that I try and share with my students all the time, is in terms of like, listen, yeah, you maybe had a rough day, you had a rough experience, whatever, but how we get back on the bicycle, how, we can use this to fuel moving forward. So that's kind of my thing, at least.
Yeah, what Brian was saying about like basically keeping track of your failures and using that to fuel you, but also knowing that anyone successful you see has had that long list of failures. It reminds me so much when you hear someone like Vince Vaughn, and the entire time you're talking, for some reason I was thinking Vin Diesel, who's someone different.
It's a very guy.
It took me a second to remember who that was, but that when you hear someone like Vince Vaughn or Vin Diesel talk about that sort of thing, it's like, well, yeah, you're Vince Vaughn. It's easy for you to talk about all your failures. You're still like a highly successful actor. And like the thing that gets me so much, like, and I referenced Queen earlier. If you've seen the Queen movie Bohemian Rhapsody, it's like we know them as Queen from, the 1980s, like the Queen that everyone knows. We didn't know them as Queen, the complete failures. Right. And it's so easy, hindsight's always 20/20, as they say, like once you've got that, big gig or whatever, to look back and say like, oh yeah, I totally could have done this in the first place. But until you do, you lack that self-confidence. And like for myself personally, it's a delicate balancing act of knowing like, no, your failures don't dictate your successes, and it will turn out okay, but you don't have that comfort until it does turn out okay.
We joked about The Office. Has anybody listened to the Office Ladies podcast? It's pretty new.
But it's been mentioned.
Yeah, it's Jenna Fisher and Angela Kinsey that play Pam and Angela on the show. They basically go through each episode and do like almost like a DVD commentary to it, but then they give out fun facts and talk about stuff. It's good. There's they talk about being, because we think of The Office as like so successful, but they talk about being in like towards the middle and end of season 2, and they're still like doing side gigs and like side hustles because they're so unsure about, like, we think of The Office as like a success, as like, oh, you got on The Office, you're a success. But they're like, yeah, we shot the first 6 episodes or whatever, and it was like 6 months until we got picked up. So they were still doing like waitressing and doing improv and just trying to scrape by.
Jenna Fisher talks about, I haven't listened to that podcast, but I've heard her mention before, like the character that she's playing on The Office, like someone that wants to be an artist, like that's what she wants to do, but she doesn't have the confidence to go for it and is stuck in like this dead end job as a receptionist. She's like, that part that I was playing, that I was Pam Beesly in real life. Like I was waitressing and like not able to do the creative acting job that I wanted to do, and just supporting myself doing like what I could. And obviously slight difference is that she did go for it and was successful at it. But yeah, that's, I think, an interesting parallel there.
Wow. Brian, do you know Vince Vaughn in True Detective season 2?
Do.
So
do you know Vin
he's
Diesel
good, but that's some of the worst. Sorry?
Do you know Vin Diesel in Too Fast, Too Furious? Okay, to his credit, have you guys seen the movie The Iron Giant, which is one of the best animated films of all time?
Oh, it's great.
Vin Diesel is the voice of the robot in that.
So you know Too Fast, Too Furious, but you don't listen to Rush all that much?
To be fair, I don't. I actually don't watch the Fast and the Furious movies either. So
I've watched all 7.
But I have seen The Iron Giant, and it's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's amazing allegory for nuclear war. But anyway.
How have you watched all 7?
Because they're good. Get off your high horses.
They can't be good.
Come down here with us.
Have you also watched Hobbs and Shaw? Have you watched Hobbs and Shaw as well?
I haven't.
Okay.
Yeah. Do y'all know about this is totally not worth it, but do y'all know about the Too Fast, Too Furious conundrum? the paradox of they listen to the song by Ludacris, but Ludacris is also in the movie. So who is singing the song they're listening to?
I think the greater paradox is that there's 7 of these movies.
It's just a real meta fourth wall, type of thing.
Well, you guys think
that's what it is. It's like an interstellar thing. The movie, the whole universe of Too Fast, Too Furious is just too smart. That's what it is.
Is that what it is?
That's what it is.
Who invented rock and roll, Chuck Berry or Marty McFly?
Marty McFly, right?
Yeah.
That's Domino.
That's Domino, yeah. Okay, well, let's put a lid on this nonsense. Thank you all so much. That was fun, and thanks for digging out something to share. And this was 214, so we'll catch you all on 215. And okay, bye everybody.
See ya.
Yep.
See ya.